Richard Gardiner is a firearms attorney who I interview quite often because he knows DC laws so well. And
Yes. He's a friend of Entering News as well. Richard, welcome.
Thank you.
so tell me, Richard, you know DC's crazy gun laws more than anyone. What is the law on magazines, and what did David Gregory do that was illegal?
Well, it's illegal to possess what they call a large capacity ammunition feeding device, which is basically a magazine that holds more than 10 rounds of ammunition. And there are no exceptions to that prohibition. Interestingly enough, there isn't even an exception for law enforcement. So strictly speaking, no cops in D.C. could possess large capacity ammunition feeding devices either. I suspect the city council, in its hurry to get this law passed, just overlooked that fact, and obviously the police aren't going to prosecute themselves, but they should if they wanted to really stick to the law.
Interesting.
The penalty for possession, and it's simple possession. There doesn't have to be knowledge or intent. Is a fine of up to $1,000 and or a jail sentence of up to 1 year. And if Mr. Gregory had that magazine, and in fact it was a large capacity ammunition feeding device in D.C., he is in violation of the law. It's very, very simple. Whether he had good advice or bad advice or no advice at all is completely irrelevant to this law.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's a very good point.
And if the police had any sense of honesty and any sense of fair play, he would be prosecuted for this.
But
they've got photographs of him, so it'd be a very, very easy case to make. And of course, D.C. has generally in the past not hesitated to prosecute people for possession of these. I had a case just a couple of weeks ago with a gentleman who was charged with possession of a large capacity ammunition feeding device because he was a Maryland resident who had driven into D.C. to drop his wife off and was going to leave the district immediately as soon as she got out of the car. Unfortunately, he made an illegal U-turn, and when he went to stop to let her off, and he got stopped by a patrol officer who asked him, do you have any firearms in the car? And he, being an honest fellow from Maryland where he could lawfully possess it, said yes, and the next thing he knew, he was being taken off in handcuffs.
Well, so this client of yours, what is the status in the same crime?
There is an exemption in the D.C. law, as Emily, you very well know, because we've talked about it before, for transporting firearms through the district.
Right. It's the same as the federal transport laws.
Right. And unfortunately, the police officer in this case didn't know about that.
Not surprised.
And arrested him, and we went to trial, and the judge, after the trial, ultimately ruled that he was in compliance with the transport law and found him not guilty.
That's good to hear.
But we had to go to trial, and
he had to hire a lawyer, and had to go through all this stuff, and that's what continually happens. And I should say I'm surprised, but I hear these stories all the time from Richard because he is the first call of anybody.
Right,
I think
right.
when they go through the stuff, and also Richard, talk about I wanted to talk about Augustine Kim, Lieutenant Augustine Kim, and his story, which I've profiled and has helped change some of the laws in D.C. a little bit to make it, maybe sometimes not a crime, but, what regular people, like you just said, this client of yours from Maryland and other, veterans are treated because of these firearm laws versus how this, wealthy NBC anchor David Gregory is treated.
Well, the point is that D.C. has a policy of prosecuting these, and if Mr. Gregory isn't prosecuted, it's just going to show that the wealthy and the elite get special benefits.
That's right.
I mean, they prosecute the gentleman I was just talking to you about, who's just an average citizen from Maryland. They prosecuted Lieutenant Kim for possession of unregistered firearms, and he was a National Guard Army officer, and he got arrested and spent time in the D.C. jail.
And he was going to, if I remember correctly, he was coming through D.C. legally transporting, locked in the case in his trunk, and had to stop at Walter Reed for an appointment, a doctor's appointment, because he'd been injured in Iraq. and spent the night in jail.
Right.
And his guns he was legally transporting, in my opinion.
Thank you for your service. We're going to put you in jail now.
Yeah, exactly. And again, the traffic stop, and the officer asked him if he has any firearms in the car, and he, believing that he's in compliance with the federal law, says, yes, I do. And the next thing he knows, he's handcuffed and being dragged off to the D.C. jail.
I do have to put something in here. Richard Gardiner, I get the best legal advice from him. He says, Richard, say what you say what your advice as my favorite firearms attorney, what you should do when asked if you have a gun by these cops, like cops in D.C. who don't know the federal transport laws.
You remain silent. I mean,
Right.
We have a constitutional right to remain silent when questioned by law enforcement, and the best thing to do is, no matter what the question, even if you don't have any firearms in the car, is just keep quiet. You don't have to answer that question, and you shouldn't, because anytime you say anything, you're opening yourself up to for the possibility of having your vehicle searched, and who knows what they might potentially find. Particularly for people who say have a rented car. I've had clients who had rented cars and have been surprised when they say, sure, go ahead, take a look, and then something is found they didn't even know about.
I didn't even know that. I just think it's so important. I just want all, gun owners to know that, especially in places like D.C. and Massachusetts and Illinois, where the laws are so wacky and the police don't know what the federal laws are, that they, I hate to say it, but it's best not to be, a do-gooder and honest and just keep quiet.
Well, and Richard, we're speaking with Richard Gardiner, attorney, and it's John Pop with Emily Miller from the Washington Times, and you know what, Emily and I were talking about this, Richard, and this is less on the legal, more on what I'll say the side of the hypocrisy of it all. That David Gregory, the story around the David Gregory story, I've been following for the last couple of days here doing news updates and things here at NRA News, is that first he checked with D.C. police. We have a good paper trail of that.
Well, I talked to Chief Lanier's office today, and they said he asked us for permission and we denied it.
Right. Okay. So, but we're focusing on, and then he checked. Now there's a story out, CNN reporting today that there's confusion because the ATF it said it was okay, but Richard,
which doesn't have jurisdiction, right, Richard? ATF?
The ATF doesn't have any authority to interpret D.C. law. I don't know why anyone would even bother asking ATF.
And my further point, Richard and Emily, is, you know what, law-abiding citizens, veterans, people who break these laws get no slack. Like you said, ignorance is no excuse for the law. Right. So why are we still even talking about this if he violated the law and he was on national TV when he did it?
Yeah,
that's right.
Richard,
that's right.
Richard Gardiner, as you said from the beginning, look, say it again. I think it's important to reemphasize. The knowledge of the law doesn't change if he broke the law.
Ignorance of the law is no excuse. Am I correct there, Richard?
That's correct. For this particular law, ignorance is no excuse. Either you have it in your possession or you don't. It's that simple. And I think that's not a very good law. I mean, this whole law, of course, is not a very good law. But if we're going to if DC is going to have it on the books, then it ought to be enforced equally against everybody. Now,
that's right.
Ultimately, what probably should happen in this case is, given the fact that maybe there was some confusion, if that in fact turns out to be the case, maybe there ought to be some kind of plea agreement worked out for him, which is what generally happens with people I've represented, where they, like with Mr. Kim, where someone can plead guilty and then do maybe community service or something like that, and end up with a lesser charge and not ultimately go to jail. But he ought to be treated the same way as anybody else is treated, and not given special dispensation merely because he's a member of the media trying to make a point, an invalid point at that, but a point.
That's a good point. And also, but I want to ask you, Richard, the police, this all happened Sunday. We're now at Thursday night, and last I spoke to Lanier's office this afternoon, they are still investigating, quote unquote investigating. And I talked to some other more rank and file officers as well, and they said if this had been anyone else, there would have been a warrant for the arrest days ago, and he had been arrested. In your experience, what has been the lag time between suspicion or knowledge of breaking a firearms law and an arrest made?
Well, I mean, usually it's done right in the presence of the officer, so the arrest is instantaneous. It's a little bit unusual situation where it's come to their attention because it was on television, but I don't see why 2 or 3 days shouldn't take 2 or 3 days to conduct an investigation, because the only thing they could be investigating is whether he had knowledge or not, but knowledge is irrelevant under the way the city council has passed this law. As I said, it's just a question of Did he possess it? Was he in the District of Columbia? End of discussion.
That's right. I mean, I'll tell you, I also profiled Specialist Adam Meckler, who had forgotten that he had nine or 10 rounds of ammunition in his backpack, went into the VFW, and he was thrown in jail and didn't want to, just didn't have the money for an attorney at the time and didn't have the time. So he ended up having to take a plea deal. And I still talked to Specialist Meckler. He, he didn't have a gun, to be clear. He just had some loose rounds, and he didn't know the law, of course, because it's a crazy law that you have to register ammunition in D.C. But like Richard Gardiner just said, it's not, not knowing the law is not an excuse. And so he, still feels guilty about having this, criminal record for what he did.
It's amazing. Richard, thank you so much, sir, for always being there to keep it straight here with the legal stuff when it has to do with the Second Amendment and firearms. We appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Glad to talk to you.